In the heart of London, where thousands of tourists gather daily to witness the unchanging tradition of the Queen's Guard, something happened that no one saw coming. For over 350 years, these soldiers have stood motionless, their faces hidden beneath towering bearskin hats, trained to ignore every distraction. They are living statues, symbols of unwavering discipline and royal protection. But on one ordinary Tuesday morning, when a young American tourist named Kate approached the guard post at Buckingham Palace, the impossible happened. The guard moved, not just a slight shift or adjustment that might go unnoticed, but a deliberate, urgent movement that sent shockwaves through the crowd and set off a chain of events that would make international headlines. What Kate didn't know was that her innocent approach to the sentry box would trigger a response that exposed a hidden threat, saved lives, and revealed the extraordinary human being beneath the ceremonial uniform. This is the true story of how a moment of perceived protocol breach became an act of heroism that changed everything anyone thought they knew about the Queen's Guard, and why sometimes breaking the rules is exactly what needs to happen. Kate Morrison had dreamed of visiting London since she was 12 years old, poring over travel magazines in her bedroom in small-town Ohio. At 23, fresh out of college with a degree in art history, she had finally saved enough money from her part-time job at a local cafe to make the trip happen. This was her third day in the city, and she had planned every moment meticulously. The Tower of London on day 1, the British Museum on day 2, and today, the crown jewel of her itinerary, Buckingham Palace and the famous changing of the guard ceremony. She woke up early that Tuesday morning in her modest hostel room in King's Cross, her excitement barely contained. The weather was typical for October in London, overcast with a light drizzle that seemed to hang in the air rather than fall. Kate pulled on her best jeans, a warm sweater her grandmother had knitted for the trip, and her trusty walking boots. She checked her camera battery twice, made sure her memory card was empty and ready for hundreds of photos, and headed out into the London morning. The Underground was already bustling with commuters, their faces buried in newspapers or phones, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who navigated this route every day. Kate pressed her face to the window as the train emerged from the tunnel, watching the city wake up around her. Red double-decker buses lined the streets, early morning joggers pounded through the parks, and the Thames sparkled gray-brown in the weak sunlight that fought its way through the clouds. She emerged from Green Park Station with a small crowd of other tourists, most of them clutching guidebooks and looking as excited as she felt. The walk to Buckingham Palace took less than 10 minutes, but Kate stopped frequently to take photos of everything. The elegant Georgian architecture, the perfectly manicured gardens, even the ornate street lamps that lined the mall. Everything felt magical, like stepping into a postcard she had stared at for years. As she approached the palace gates, Kate was struck by how much larger and more impressive the building was than she had imagined. The cream-colored Portland stone facade stretched endlessly in both directions, with its 775 rooms hidden behind hundreds of precisely aligned windows. The Victoria Memorial stood proudly in front of the palace, its golden angel pointing skyward as if blessing all who passed below. But what captured Kate's attention most were the guards. She had read about them, of course, watched videos online, but seeing them in person was entirely different. 2 guards stood at the main gate, perfectly still in their iconic red tunics and towering black bearskin hats. Their faces were invisible beneath the shadow of their headgear, their white gloves gripping their rifles with mathematical precision. They were like statues, so motionless that Kate found herself staring just to see if she could detect the rise and fall of their chests as they breathed. The growing crowd around the palace was a mix of nationalities and ages. Families with excited children pointed at the guards. Elderly couples held hands as they reminisced about previous visits, and fellow backpackers like Kate snapped photos from every conceivable angle. The atmosphere was festive, filled with anticipation for the ceremony that would begin in just over an hour. Kate positioned herself near the central gates, finding a spot where she could get clear photos, while still being respectful of the barriers that kept tourists at an appropriate distance. She spent several minutes adjusting her camera settings, wanting to capture the perfect shot. The guards seemed completely oblivious to the crowd, their training evident in their absolute stillness and focus straight ahead. As she watched, Kate noticed something that struck her as both impressive and slightly unsettling. No matter what happened around them, the guards never reacted. A small child threw a ball that bounced near one guard's feet, and he didn't even glance down. A group of teenagers tried to get the other guard's attention by waving and calling out, but he might as well have been carved from stone. It was a level of discipline and control that Kate couldn't quite comprehend. The morning progressed peacefully, with the crowd growing larger and more excited as the time for the ceremony approached. Kate struck up conversations with other tourists, sharing travel tips and taking photos for families who wanted to pose together with the palace in the background. She learned that the couple next to her were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary with their first trip to Europe, and that the young family behind her had saved for 3 years to bring their children to see where the Queen lived. Around 10:30, something shifted in the atmosphere. Kate noticed it first as a subtle change in the crowd's behavior. People began looking around more frequently. Some seemed to be searching for something or someone in the gathering masses. A few individuals near the back of the crowd started moving differently, not with the casual curiosity of tourists, but with more purpose and urgency. Kate assumed it was just the natural excitement building as the ceremony time approached. But she noticed that some of the palace security personnel had also become more active. Men and women in dark suits were speaking quietly into small microphones attached to their lapels, their eyes constantly scanning the crowd. She had seen security at tourist attractions before, but this seemed different somehow. More intense. What Kate didn't know was that at exactly 10:15 a.m., intelligence services had received credible information about a potential security threat targeting the palace. The details were vague but concerning enough that additional plainclothes officers had been deployed into the crowd, and all personnel, including the ceremonial guards, had been briefed about heightened awareness protocols. Guard James Mitchell had been standing at his post for 45 minutes when the alert came through his nearly invisible earpiece. 24 years old. From a military family in Scotland, James had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard 6 months earlier. His training had been extensive, not just in ceremonial duties, but in threat assessment and crowd control. He knew that beneath the pageantry and tradition, his primary responsibility was security. The message in his earpiece was brief but clear. Possible threat in crowd, subject description. Female, early 20s, brown hair, blue backpack, may approach perimeter. Maintain position but stay alert for unusual behavior. James felt his pulse quicken slightly, but his training took over immediately. His posture remained perfect, his gaze fixed straight ahead, but every sense was now hyper-tuned to his surroundings. He could hear individual conversations in the crowd, smell the mixture of perfumes and coffee from the nearby cafe, feel the slight vibration of the pavement as hundreds of people shifted and moved around him. From his peripheral vision, he began cataloging faces and behaviors. An elderly man with a walking stick moved slowly past with his wife. A group of school children listened intently as their teacher explained the history of the guards. A young woman with brown hair and a blue backpack stood near the center barrier, taking photos with obvious delight. Kate was completely absorbed in trying to capture the perfect shot when she noticed something odd in her viewfinder. Through her camera lens, she could see what appeared to be a small package or object that someone had dropped near the base of the memorial. It was partially hidden behind an ornamental plant, but something about it seemed out of place. She lowered her camera and looked with her naked eye, trying to get a better view. The package was small, about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in brown paper with what appeared to be wires protruding from one end. Kate's heart began to race as her mind processed what she was seeing. She had grown up in post-9/11 America, where everyone was taught to be aware of unattended packages and suspicious items. This looked exactly like something they showed in safety presentations. Kate looked around, trying to see if anyone else had noticed the package or if its owner might be nearby looking for it. The crowd continued its normal behavior, people chatting and taking photos, children running around their parents' feet. No one seemed to be missing anything or searching for a lost item. The package sat there innocuous to everyone else, but increasingly alarming to Kate. She realized she needed to alert someone, but she wasn't sure who or how. The uniformed police officers she could see were positioned too far away, and she didn't want to cause a panic by shouting across the crowd. Her eyes settled on the nearest guard, the young man standing ramrod straight at the main gate. She knew that approaching the guards was discouraged, that they were trained not to respond to tourists, but this felt like an emergency. Kate took a deep breath and began walking toward the guard post. her heart pounding with each step. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her as other tourists noticed her movement toward the restricted area. Some people began pointing and whispering. Others reached for their cameras, assuming she was about to become one of those viral videos of tourists bothering the Queen's Guard. As Kate approached the guard, she noticed for the first time how young he looked, probably close to her own age. She could see just the bottom edge of his face beneath the bearskin hat, enough to see that his jaw was set with determination and discipline. She stopped about 3 feet away from him, well outside the clearly marked boundaries, and spoke in a clear, urgent whisper. "Excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you, but I think there might be something dangerous near the memorial. There's a package with wires, and I don't think it belongs to anyone here." For a moment, nothing happened. The guard remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed ahead, and Kate wondered if he had even heard her. The crowd behind her had grown quiet, watching the interaction with intense curiosity. Some people had their phones out, recording what they expected would be another example of a tourist being ignored by the famously unresponsive guards. But James Mitchell had heard every word clearly, and his training in threat assessment was already processing the information. A suspicious package with visible wires near a major royal landmark, reported by someone matching the description in his security briefing. The timing, the location, the details, everything aligned with the intelligence they had received. In a split second, James made a decision that would change everything. James Mitchell had less than 2 seconds to make a decision that went against every protocol he had learned in his 6 months as a Queen's Guard. Stand motionless and follow procedure, or trust his instincts and potentially save lives. The weight of 350 years of tradition pressed down on him like the heavy bearskin hat on his head. But the urgency in the young woman's voice and the description she had given cut through his ceremonial training like a knife. Without moving his head, James shifted his eyes to locate the package Kate had described. There, partially hidden behind the ornamental plantings at the base of the Victoria Memorial, he could see the brown paper wrapping and what definitely appeared to be electrical wires. His military experience from Afghanistan kicked in immediately. He had seen improvised explosive devices before, and this had all the hallmarks of something that didn't belong in a public space. The crowd had grown eerily quiet, all eyes focused on the unprecedented scene of a tourist actually getting close enough to speak to a guard. Mobile phones were held high, recording what everyone assumed would be another example of the guard's famous ability to ignore any distraction. Children pointed from behind their parents, and elderly visitors leaned forward in anticipation. What happened next would be replayed on news channels around the world for months to come. James broke his stance. It wasn't a small movement or a subtle shift that might go unnoticed. The guard spun on his heel with military precision, his rifle moving smoothly to a ready position as he began striding directly toward the suspicious package. The movement was so sudden, so completely unexpected, that the crowd around Kate actually gasped audibly. "Everyone back! Clear the area immediately," James commanded in a voice that carried the authority of his military training and the urgency of someone who understood exactly what they might be dealing with. "This is not a drill! Move back to the street level now." The transformation was stunning. One moment he had been a silent, motionless figure of ceremony, and the next he was a highly trained soldier, in command of a potentially deadly situation. Kate stood frozen for a moment, shocked by the sudden validation that her concern had been taken seriously before James's voice jolted her into action. "You two miss. Thank you for the alert, but you need to get clear of the area immediately." The crowd's reaction was a mixture of excitement, confusion, and growing alarm. Some people immediately began backing away, sensing the seriousness in the guard's voice. Others pressed forward, thinking this might be some kind of special demonstration or photo opportunity. Parents grabbed their children, elderly visitors looked around uncertainly, and the general chatter of hundreds of conversations died to a worried murmur. Within seconds, palace security personnel who had been positioned throughout the crowd began moving with coordinated precision. The plainclothes officers who had seemed like regular tourists moments before were now clearly identifiable as they directed people away from the memorial area and spoke rapidly into their communication devices. Kate found herself swept along with the crowd as they were efficiently but firmly moved back toward the street. She kept looking over her shoulder, trying to see what was happening near the memorial. The guard who had responded to her warning was now kneeling beside the package, but she couldn't make out what he was doing from her new position behind the growing security perimeter. What Kate couldn't see was the intense concentration on James Mitchell's face as he examined the device up close. His training in explosive ordnance from his military service told him immediately that this was real, and it was active. The wiring was crude but functional. The timing device was counting down, and based on the size of the package, there was enough explosive material to cause significant casualties in the densely packed crowd. Through his earpiece, James could hear the rapid coordination of emergency response. Bomb Squad ETA 7 minutes. Armed response units positioning. Evacuation protocol. Charlie in effect. The calm professional voices belied the urgency of the situation, but James knew that 7 minutes might be too long. The timer on the device showed 4 minutes and 37 seconds. James spoke quietly into his shoulder microphone, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. This is Mitchell at main gate. Device is confirmed active with visible timer. 4 minutes, 20 seconds and counting. Recommend immediate full evacuation of the memorial area and coordinate with Bomb Squad for remote detonation protocols. Around him, the evacuation was proceeding with remarkable efficiency. The Metropolitan Police units that had been stationed around the palace had smoothly transitioned from ceremonial crowd control to emergency response. Barriers were being repositioned to create a much larger security perimeter, and additional officers were arriving every few seconds to help manage the growing crowd of evacuees. Kate found herself standing next to the elderly couple she had spoken with earlier, the ones celebrating their anniversary. The woman was clutching her husband's arm, her face pale with worry. "We were standing right there just 5 minutes ago," she whispered. If that young lady hadn't noticed something wrong, the crowd around them was buzzing with a mixture of fear and fascination. Mobile phones were everywhere, with people simultaneously trying to capture footage while backing away from the potential danger. Social media was already exploding with shaky videos and confused posts about something happening at Buckingham Palace. Back at the device, James was faced with an impossible decision. The bomb squad was still minutes away, and the timer was now showing less than 3 minutes. The evacuation was proceeding well, but there were still hundreds of people within the potential blast radius. Based on his assessment of the device, anyone within 50 meters could be seriously injured or killed when it detonated. Through his earpiece came a voice he recognized as the security coordinator. "Mitchell, bomb squad is stuck in traffic. ETA now 10 minutes. Can you confirm timer status?" 2 minutes, 40 seconds. James responded. "Sir, respectfully, we don't have 10 minutes. There was a pause that seemed to stretch forever, filled only by the sounds of the ongoing evacuation and the quiet ticking that James was sure he could hear from the device, though he knew that was impossible. Then the voice came back, heavy with the weight of command decision. "Mitchell, you are authorized to attempt manual disarmament. Repeat, you are cleared for manual intervention. Be advised, if unsuccessful, move to minimum safe distance immediately." James felt his training take over completely. The ceremonial aspects of his role disappeared entirely, replaced by the combat engineer skills he had learned in the army. He had disarmed devices before, though never with thousands of people watching from behind, hastily erected barriers and news helicopters beginning to circle overhead. The device was relatively simple in construction, which was both good and bad news. Simple meant fewer components to worry about, but it also meant fewer options if something went wrong. The timer was connected to the main charge through a series of colored wires, and James could see that cutting the wrong one would likely trigger immediate detonation. With 1 minute and 55 seconds on the timer, James began the delicate process of tracing each wire to its connection point. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled, but he was acutely aware that one mistake would cost him his life and potentially many others. Kate was watching from the street level, pressed against the new security barrier with hundreds of other evacuees. She could barely make out the figure of the guard, kneeling beside the memorial, but she knew he was trying to disarm whatever she had spotted. The guilt was overwhelming. She had approached him hoping he would alert someone else, never imagining that he would be the one risking his life to deal with the threat. The crowd around her had grown silent. The festive atmosphere of a morning at Buckingham Palace replaced by the tense quiet of people watching a life-or-death situation unfold. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, staying close to their parents without the usual chatter and movement. News vans were arriving at the outer perimeter, their satellite dishes extending skyward as reporters began setting up for what was clearly becoming a major story. The morning commute in central London had been disrupted as police redirected traffic around the growing security zone. What had started as a routine day for thousands of people was rapidly becoming something that would be remembered and talked about for years. James isolated the timer circuit and found the wire that would safely interrupt the countdown. With 43 seconds remaining, he carefully positioned his wire cutters. Everything he had learned about explosive devices, every exercise he had completed in training, every real-world situation he had faced in combat zones had prepared him for this moment. But as he prepared to make the cut that would either save lives or end his own, James noticed something that changed everything. There was a secondary timer hidden beneath the primary device, connected to a completely different circuit. This wasn't just a bomb. It was a bomb designed to fool someone exactly like him into making exactly the mistake he was about to make. The discovery of the secondary timer changed everything for James Mitchell. With 38 seconds remaining on the visible countdown, he realized he was looking at a sophisticated psychological trap designed specifically to target someone with his training. The hidden device was meant to detonate when the primary timer was disarmed, creating a false sense of security before the real explosion occurred. James spoke rapidly into his microphone, his voice maintaining professional calm despite the revelation. "Command, this is Mitchell. Device is more complex than initially assessed. Secondary trigger mechanism discovered. Recommend immediate expansion of evacuation perimeter and preparation for controlled detonation." The response came back immediately. "Roger, Mitchell. New assessment of safe distance." James studied the hidden device, trying to calculate the total explosive yield based on what he could see. Based on secondary package size, recommend minimum 100 meters clear zone. Repeat, 100 meters minimum. Through his earpiece, James could hear the controlled chaos of emergency response coordination. Orders were being given to expand the evacuation zone. Additional police units were being deployed to manage the growing crowd, and somewhere in the background he could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors as news crews and additional emergency services converged on the scene. Kate was among the hundreds of people being moved even further back from the memorial as the new safety perimeter was established. She found herself on Birdcage Walk, nearly 2 blocks from where she had started her morning, watching smoke flares being deployed to mark the danger zone. The elderly anniversary couple was still beside her, and the woman kept repeating, "That brave young man standing there all alone." What Kate didn't know was that James Mitchell wasn't actually alone. While the crowd could only see one figure in a red tunic kneeling beside the memorial, a second Queen's Guard, Corporal Sarah Chen, had positioned herself at the opposite entrance to provide backup and additional security assessment. Sarah had been monitoring the situation through her own communication system and was ready to assist if needed. 28 seconds remained on the visible timer when James made a decision that went against every piece of conventional wisdom about explosive devices. Instead of attempting to disarm either timer, he was going to move the entire device to a position where its detonation would cause minimal damage to the memorial and no harm to the evacuated civilians. The Victoria Memorial, with its massive marble and bronze construction, could absorb much of the blast if the device were positioned correctly. The challenge was moving an active bomb while wearing a heavy ceremonial uniform and maintaining the steady hands necessary to avoid triggering any motion-sensitive backup detonators that might be hidden within the device. James carefully lifted the package, noting its weight and the way the wires moved as he adjusted his grip. 18 seconds on the timer. The device felt stable, but he knew that appearances could be deceiving with improvised explosives. Every step toward the base of the memorial was measured and deliberate, his training overriding the natural human instinct to rush when facing imminent danger. 15 seconds. James positioned the device against the massive stone base of the memorial, angling it so that the blast would be directed upward and away from the surrounding area. The memorial had survived the London Blitz. It could handle what was coming. From her position on Birdcage Walk, Kate watched the red uniformed figure moving with careful precision around the memorial. The entire crowd had fallen silent, hundreds of people holding their breath as they watched someone risk his life to protect strangers. Mobile phone cameras captured every moment, but the usual chatter of social media posts had been replaced by an almost religious quiet. 10 seconds. James activated his radio one final time. Device positioned for minimal impact. All personnel maintain current positions. Detonation imminent. Detonation basis. James began his movement away from the device, his pace quick but controlled. His goal was to reach the relative shelter of the palace gates before detonation, but he knew the timing would be extremely close. 5 seconds. James cleared the Memorial Plaza and dove behind the substantial stone pillars that flanked the palace entrance. 3 seconds. The visible timer reached 0. Nothing happened. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, the silence was complete. James remained in his protective position, knowing that the secondary device was still active and potentially more dangerous than the primary timer had been. The crowd in the distance began to murmur, uncertain whether the crisis had passed or if something even worse was about to occur. Then, exactly 43 seconds after the primary timer had reached 0, the secondary device detonated. The explosion was massive, but contained exactly as James had predicted. The blast echoed off the surrounding buildings like thunder, sending a column of smoke and debris skyward, but directing most of its force harmlessly into the air above the memorial. The memorial itself, constructed of materials designed to last centuries, absorbed the impact with only minor surface damage to its base. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Screams of shock mixed with cheers of relief as people realized that the crisis had passed and no one had been injured. The young guard who had taken such incredible risks to protect them was already emerging from his shelter, visibly unharmed and immediately beginning to coordinate with other security personnel for post-incident procedures. Kate found herself crying without realizing it, overwhelmed by the intensity of the situation and her role in its resolution. The elderly woman next to her was sobbing openly, and her husband was repeating, "Magnificent, absolutely magnificent," while shaking his head in amazement. What followed was a carefully choreographed post-incident response that demonstrated the professionalism of all the emergency services involved. Bomb disposal experts arrived to examine the scene and ensure no additional devices were present. Medical personnel checked on James and other security staff who had been in the immediate area. Metropolitan Police began the process of interviewing witnesses and collecting evidence. James Mitchell was escorted away from the scene for debriefing and medical evaluation, still in his ceremonial uniform but now bearing the unmistakable bearing of someone who had just faced down a life-threatening situation. As he walked past the crowd barrier, spontaneous applause broke out among the evacuated tourists and locals. People reached out to touch his hand or simply to say thank you as he passed. Kate managed to catch his attention for just a moment as he walked by. Their eyes met, and he gave her a small nod of acknowledgement before continuing on his way. No words were exchanged, but both understood the significance of that brief interaction. Her decision to speak up despite social conventions had saved lives, and his decision to break with tradition had prevented what could have been a devastating tragedy. The investigation that followed would reveal that the device had indeed been planted by individuals with terrorist intentions, specifically designed to target the tourist crowds that gathered at Buckingham Palace each day. Intelligence services had received fragmentary warnings about the planned attack, but without Kate's observational skills and James's decisive action, the outcome would have been catastrophic. What emerged in the hours and days following the incident was a story that captured the public imagination far beyond the immediate drama of the bomb disposal. Here was a young American tourist whose respect for tradition had been overcome by her sense of civic responsibility, and a ceremonial guard whose willingness to break protocol had saved countless lives. The media coverage was immediate and intense. Within hours, footage of the incident was being broadcast around the world, with particular focus on the unprecedented sight of a Queen's Guard abandoning his post to respond to a security threat. Social media exploded with hashtags like Guardian Angel and Buckingham Hero, while news anchors struggled to convey the significance of what had happened. But for Kate Morrison, sitting in a police station giving her witness statement, the global attention was the last thing on her mind. She kept thinking about that moment when she had decided to approach the guard, knowing it went against everything she had been told about tourist etiquette in London. Her small act of courage in speaking up had set in motion events that prevented what investigators would later describe as a potential mass casualty incident. The ripple effects of that Tuesday morning would continue for months, changing security protocols at royal residences, influencing training procedures for ceremonial guards, and creating a new understanding of how traditional roles could adapt to modern threats while maintaining their essential character and dignity. 3 days after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Kate Morrison sat in the comfortable living room of a modest flat in Edinburgh, Scotland, sharing tea and biscuits with James Mitchell's parents. The surreal nature of her situation was not lost on her. She had come to London as an anonymous tourist from Ohio, and now she was being treated as a hero by the British press and invited into the homes of people she had never imagined meeting. The invitation had come through official channels. James's mother, Margaret Mitchell, had contacted the American embassy requesting Kate's information so she could personally thank the young woman who had helped save her son's life. What had started as a formal letter of gratitude had evolved into an invitation to visit Scotland and meet the family of the man whose courage had captivated the world. James himself was on mandatory leave following the incident, a standard protocol for any guard involved in a significant security event. He sat across from Kate in civilian clothes, looking remarkably ordinary without his ceremonial uniform. Gone was the imposing figure in red tunic and bearskin hat. Instead, Kate found herself talking with a thoughtful young man who seemed almost embarrassed by the international attention his actions had generated. "The thing is," James explained, stirring his tea slowly, "we train for situations like this constantly. The ceremonial duties are just one part of what we do. The media has made it sound like I abandoned centuries of tradition, but the truth is, the tradition has always been about protecting the crown and the people. I just did my job." Margaret Mitchell disagreed with her son's modest assessment. A retired teacher with silver hair and kind eyes, she had spent the past 3 days fielding calls from journalists around the world, all wanting to know more about the young man who had become an overnight sensation. "James has always been like this," she told Kate. "Even as a child, he would see someone in trouble and simply act without thinking about the consequences for himself." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James's younger sister, Emma, who burst through the front door with the enthusiasm of a 16-year-old who had just discovered that her brother was famous. She was clutching a stack of newspapers, all featuring variations of the same story about the guard who broke protocol to save lives. "You won't believe what they're saying about you online," Emma announced, dropping into a chair and spreading the papers across the coffee table. "There are memes, fan art, people calling you the most eligible bachelor in Britain. It's mad." Kate found herself laughing for the first time since the incident. The normalcy of family teasing felt wonderful after 3 days of intense police interviews, embassy meetings, and media requests. She had turned down most interview requests, feeling uncomfortable with the attention, but this kitchen table conversation felt like exactly what she needed. What Kate learned during her afternoon with the Mitchell family was that James's decision to act had not been as spontaneous as it appeared. His military service in Afghanistan had included specialized training in explosive ordnance disposal, and his assignment to the Queen's Guard had been partly based on this additional skill set. The ceremonial guards were not just decorative figures. They were highly trained soldiers capable of responding to exactly the kind of threat that had materialized that Tuesday morning. "The public sees the pageantry and assumes that's all there is," explained James's father, Robert, a retired Royal Navy officer. "But these lads are combat veterans, many of them. The bearskin hats and red tunics don't change the fact that they're soldiers first." As the afternoon wore on, Kate began to understand the broader implications of what had happened. The incident had sparked a global conversation about the balance between tradition and security, about the role of vigilant citizens in preventing terrorism, and about the human beings who stood behind ceremonial roles. James shared that he had received thousands of letters and emails from around the world, many from military families, expressing pride in his actions, others from tourists, who said they would never again hesitate to report suspicious activity. One letter that particularly moved him came from a veteran who had lost his leg to an improvised explosive device in Iraq, thanking James for showing that the skills learned in combat could be used to protect innocent civilians. The investigation into the bombing plot had revealed a sophisticated operation involving several individuals who had been planning the attack for months. The device that Kate had spotted was one of 3 that had been placed around central London that morning, targeting tourist-heavy areas during peak visiting hours. The other 2 devices had been located and safely disposed of after the Buckingham Palace incident prompted a comprehensive security sweep of the area. Intelligence services estimated that the 3 devices combined could have killed or injured hundreds of people if they had detonated as planned. Kate's decision to speak up and James's willingness to act on her warning had not only prevented casualties at the palace, but had also led to the discovery and neutralization of the broader terrorist plot. "I keep thinking about all the people who were there that morning," Kate confided to the Mitchell family. Families on vacation, elderly couples celebrating anniversaries, school groups learning about history. If something had happened to them because I was too polite to speak up, Margaret reached across the table to squeeze Kate's hand. "But you did speak up, dear. That's what matters. You saw something wrong and you found the courage to act despite feeling uncomfortable about approaching James. That kind of civic-mindedness is becoming rare in the world." The global media coverage had indeed been unprecedented. The story had captured public imagination, partly because it represented something hopeful in an age of increasing cynicism about institutions and individual responsibility. Here was a young tourist who cared enough about strangers to risk embarrassment, and a ceremonial guard who valued human life over rigid protocol. James had been contacted by documentary filmmakers, book publishers, and even Hollywood producers interested in adapting the story. He had politely declined all offers, preferring to return to his duties once his mandatory leave was completed. "I didn't do this to become famous," he told Kate. "I did it because it was the right thing to do in that moment. That's what any of my colleagues would have done in the same situation." But Kate was beginning to understand that James's humility was exactly what made the story so compelling to people around the world. In an age of manufactured celebrity and social media attention-seeking, here was someone who had performed a genuinely heroic act and then wanted nothing more than to return to his normal life and responsibilities. The conversation turned to Kate's own experience over the past 3 days. She had been overwhelmed by the media attention, the official recognition from both British and American governments, and the countless messages from strangers thanking her for her vigilance. The American ambassador to Britain had personally commended her actions, and there was talk of formal recognition from tourism and law enforcement agencies. "I keep thinking I don't deserve all this attention," Kate admitted. "I just pointed something out. James is the one who risked his life." Emma Mitchell, who had been listening quietly while scrolling through social media posts about the incident, looked up from her phone with the directness that only teenagers can manage. "You're both heroes, and you're both being modest about it. The rest of us are just grateful that there are still people like you in the world." As the afternoon stretched into evening, Kate found herself reluctant to leave the warmth and normalcy of the Mitchell family home. The conversation had ranged from the serious to the silly, touching on everything from Scottish history to American college life to James's plans for the future. It felt like visiting with old friends rather than meeting strangers brought together by extraordinary circumstances. Before she left, James walked Kate to the small train station where she would catch the evening service back to London. The October air was crisp, and the Scottish countryside stretched away in rolling hills dotted with sheep and ancient stone walls. "I wanted to ask you something," James said as they waited for the train. "That morning when you decided to approach me, what made you do it? You knew it went against everything tourists are told about the guards." Kate thought for a moment before answering. "I suppose I realized that there are times when being polite matters less than being responsible. I could see something that didn't look right, and you were the person best positioned to do something about it. It seemed more important to risk looking foolish than to risk being wrong about something dangerous." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly the kind of thinking they try to train into us in the military. Sometimes the right action is the one that breaks the rules." The train arrived, and as Kate prepared to board, James handed her a small package. "Just something small from my family. A way of saying thank you." Kate opened the package as the train pulled away from the station, waving to James through the window as the platform disappeared behind her. Inside was a small tartan scarf in the Mitchell family colors, along with a handwritten note from Margaret. For a young woman who understood that courage sometimes means speaking up when everyone else stays quiet. As the train carried her south through the darkening Scottish landscape, Kate reflected on how completely her life had changed in less than a week. She had come to London as a tourist seeking history and culture, and she was leaving as someone who had become part of a story that would be told for years to come. The incident had taught her something profound about the nature of heroism and responsibility. Real courage, she realized, wasn't about dramatic gestures or seeking recognition. It was about ordinary people making the choice to act when action was needed, even when it was uncomfortable or uncertain. When Kate's train pulled into London's King's Cross station later that evening, she was surprised to find a small crowd of people waiting with flowers and signs, thanking her for her actions. Word had somehow spread about her visit to Scotland, and strangers had come to show their appreciation for what she had done. As she made her way through the crowd, accepting handshakes and brief words of thanks, Kate understood that the story of that Tuesday morning at Buckingham Palace had become bigger than either she or James Mitchell had imagined. It had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences in the world simply by choosing to care about the safety and well-being of others. The next morning, Kate Morrison would board a flight back to Ohio, returning to her job at the local cafe and her quiet life in small-town America. But she would carry with her the knowledge that one moment of courage, one decision to speak up when something seemed wrong, had prevented a tragedy and reminded the world that heroism could be found in the most unexpected places and the most ordinary people.